But today I'm here to tell you how 4 young men I once called my protectors became my tormentors, and how a scared little girl found the strength to survive what no child should ever endure. My name is Margaret Louise Henderson, and I'm 82 years old now, sitting in my rocking chair in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with hands that have seen more than 8 decades of joy and sorrow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This story begins in 1948, when I was just 12 years old, in a small farming community called Millbrook Valley in rural Kansas. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away, and where the vast wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see under an endless prairie sky. Our farmhouse sat on 160 acres of good land that my great-grandfather had claimed during the land rush, a white 2-story house with green shutters, and a wraparound porch that my mother kept decorated with hanging baskets of petunias and morning glories. People around Millbrook Valley knew our family as the Hendersons, hard-working, God-fearing folks who never missed Sunday service at the small Lutheran church in town. My mother, Elizabeth Rose Henderson, was the heart and soul of our family. She was a woman of medium height with golden brown hair that she wore in victory rolls, even though the war had been over for 3 years. Her hands were always busy, kneading bread dough, mending clothes, braiding my hair, or playing piano at our evening family gatherings. She had the most beautiful singing voice in 3 counties, and every Sunday the congregation would fall silent just to hear her lead the hymns. My father, Robert James Henderson, was a quiet man, with strong shoulders and gentle eyes the color of summer wheat. He worked our land with pride, growing corn and wheat that fed families across the Midwest. He had served in the Pacific during the war, and though he rarely spoke of those days, sometimes I'd catch him staring off into the distance with a look that seemed to carry the weight of memories too heavy for words. He loved my mother with the kind of devotion that made other wives in town a little envious, and he treated me like I was made of precious china, always gentle, always protective. But it was my 4 older brothers who made our house feel alive with energy and laughter. There was William James, who everyone called Billy, the eldest at 19. He had my father's height and my mother's quick wit, with sandy brown hair that never seemed to stay combed no matter how much pomade he used. Billy had just returned from his first year at Kansas State University, studying agriculture with dreams of modernizing our family farm with new techniques he'd learned about crop rotation and soil conservation. Then came the twins, Michael Robert and Matthew Charles, both 17 years old but as different as night and day despite sharing the same face. Michael was the athlete, captain of the high school football team, with muscles earned from throwing hay bales and a smile that made all the girls in town blush when he walked by. Matthew was the scholar, always reading books about history and science, planning to become a teacher like our mother had been before she married father. They both had dark hair like our father, and the same mischievous green eyes that could get them out of trouble as quickly as they got into it. The youngest of my brothers was Samuel David, just 15 but already taller than me and growing like a weed. Sammy, as we all called him, was the gentle soul of the family. He spent hours in Mother's garden, learning the names of every flower and vegetable, talking to the plants like they were his closest friends. He had a gift with animals, too. Every stray cat and injured bird for miles around seemed to find its way to our porch, knowing Sammy would nurse them back to health with infinite patience. Our life in those days followed the rhythm of the seasons and the land. Spring meant planting, with all of us working together to get the seeds in the ground, while Mother packed elaborate picnic lunches that we'd eat under the old oak tree at the edge of the north field. Summer brought long days of tending crops, swimming in Miller's Creek, and catching fireflies in mason jars on warm evenings, while Mother played the piano and we all sang together on the front porch. Fall was harvest time, when neighboring families would come to help bring in our crop and we'd return the favor at their farms. The women would cook enormous meals while the men worked the fields, and the children would play hide-and-seek in the corn maze and help gather the vegetables from Mother's garden. Those October evenings, when the work was done and the barn was full of grain, felt like the whole world was golden and safe. Winter was for mending and planning, for long evenings by the fireplace while Mother read aloud from books like Little Women and Tom Sawyer. My brothers would play checkers and chess, and Billy would help the twins with their homework, while Sammy sketched pictures of the farm animals in his notebook. Mother would work on her quilting, and I learned to embroider by sitting close to her, watching her fingers create beautiful patterns with needle and thread. The house itself was our sanctuary. The kitchen was the heart of everything, with its large wood-burning stove, long pine table that seated all 6 of us comfortably, and windows that looked out over Mother's herb garden. The living room had Father's leather chair, Mother's upright piano, and a sofa covered in fabric that Mother had sewn herself, scattered with pillows that told the story of our family through the years. Upstairs, my parents had their room at the front of the house, with lace curtains and a wedding photograph on the dresser. The boys shared 2 rooms. Billy had his own small room since he was the eldest, while the twins shared 1 room and Sammy had the other. My room was at the back of the house, painted pale yellow with white furniture that Father had made himself, overlooking the garden and the chicken coop where I collected eggs every morning. But it was the small moments that made our family special. Mother singing while she cooked breakfast, her voice floating through the house like a blessing. Father teaching Billy to drive the new tractor we'd bought in 1947, both of them covered in grease but grinning like boys. The twins practicing their parts for the school play, with Michael dramatically pretending to be Romeo while Matthew corrected his pronunciation. Sammy showing me a baby rabbit he'd found, his eyes wide with wonder at the tiny creature nestled in his gentle hands. Mother had a way of making every day feel like a celebration, even when money was tight or the weather wasn't cooperating. She'd bake special cookies when one of us was sad, organize impromptu picnics when the work was done early, and create little traditions that bound us together as a family. Every birthday meant a cake made from scratch and a gift that she'd been working on in secret for weeks. Every holiday brought decorations that she'd crafted herself, and meals that made our house the envy of the county. She was also the peacemaker when my brothers got into scraps, which happened often enough with 4 boys under one roof. Mother had a way of listening to everyone's side of the story and finding solutions that left everyone feeling heard and respected. She taught us that family meant always having each other's backs, that the love between siblings was sacred and unbreakable. "Remember, Margaret," she would tell me while we worked together in her garden, "these boys are your protectors. No matter what happens in this world, your brothers will always be there to keep you safe. Family is everything, sweetheart. When the rest of the world fails you, family is what remains." I believed her completely. Why wouldn't I? Billy always made sure I got the best pieces of chicken at Sunday dinner. The twins included me in their games and taught me to throw a baseball properly. Sammy shared his secret hiding places and showed me where the wild strawberries grew along the creek bank. They teased me sometimes, the way brothers do, but it was always gentle, always with love underneath. Our life wasn't perfect. No life ever is. Money was sometimes tight, especially in the years right after the war, when prices for everything seemed to be going up faster than Father could sell his crops. Sometimes the boys would argue over chores or whose turn it was to use the truck to go to town. Sometimes Mother would get tired from all the work and need to rest, and we'd all tiptoe around the house trying not to disturb her. But we had something precious that I didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. We had each other, completely and unconditionally. We had Mother's laughter filling the kitchen, Father's steady presence making us all feel safe, and the unshakable knowledge that whatever challenges the world might bring, we would face them together as the Henderson family. I was completely unprepared for how quickly and completely that security could be shattered. How the people you trust most in the world can become strangers. How love can twist into something dark and dangerous when grief and desperation take hold of human hearts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I need to tell you about the last perfect day we had as a family, because understanding what we lost makes everything that came after so much more heartbreaking. It was a Sunday in late September 1948, just 3 weeks before everything changed forever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of October sky that makes Kansas look like a painting. The leaves on our maple trees had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and there was a hint of wood smoke in the air from chimneys throughout the valley. Mother had been up since before sunrise, as was her way, preparing for what would become our last Sunday dinner as a complete family. The smell of her famous pot roast filled the house, mixed with the sweet aroma of apple pie made from fruit we'd picked from our own orchard just the day before. She wore her best blue dress with the white collar, the one that Father had bought her for their anniversary, and her hair was perfectly set in those victory rolls that she somehow managed to make look effortless. "Margaret, sweetheart," she called to me as I came downstairs in my Sunday dress, a yellow one with tiny flowers that she'd sewn for me just a month earlier. "Would you help me set the good china? Today feels special somehow. I want everything to be perfect." I remember being surprised by that request. We usually only used the good china for Christmas and Easter, not for regular Sunday dinners. The delicate plates with their border of pink roses had belonged to my grandmother, and Mother treated them like precious artifacts. But something in her voice, a kind of wistful happiness, made me eager to help. We worked together in comfortable silence, laying out the ivory-colored plates and the silver that Mother polished religiously every month. She hummed while we worked, "In the Sweet By and By," one of her favorite hymns. Her voice was so pure and sweet that even our tabby cat Duchess came and sat in the doorway just to listen. "Mother," I asked as we folded the cloth napkins, "why does today feel different?" She paused in her work and looked at me with those warm brown eyes that always made me feel like the most important person in her world. "I don't know, darling. Sometimes you just wake up, and the world seems more beautiful than usual. Maybe it's because your father got such good news about the harvest yields this week. Maybe it's because Billy brought home such wonderful reports from college. Or maybe it's just because I have the most blessed family a woman could ask for." She pulled me into one of her soft hugs, the kind that smelled like vanilla and lavender soap, and for a moment I felt completely safe and loved in a way that children take for granted until it's gone. The boys came down for breakfast, looking unusually presentable. Billy had actually managed to tame his unruly hair, and was wearing the new shirt that Mother had made him for his return to college. The twins were matching, as they often did on Sundays, in white shirts and dark trousers, though you could tell them apart, by the way. Michael kept flexing his shoulders from football practice, while Matthew had a book tucked under his arm, even at breakfast. Sammy bounded down the stairs last, as was his habit, his hair still damp from washing, and his face shining with the enthusiasm he brought to every new day. At 15, he was caught between boyhood and becoming a man, and that morning he seemed particularly young and happy. Father came in from his morning chores with hay in his hair, and the satisfied look of a man whose animals were well fed and content. He kissed Mother on the cheek and ruffled my hair before taking his place at the head of our kitchen table for breakfast. "Smells like we're having a feast today, Lizzie," he said, using the pet name that never failed to make Mother smile. "Only the best for my family," she replied, serving him fresh biscuits with honey from our own beehives. The conversation that morning was filled with the easy chatter of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Billy told us about his mechanical engineering classes and his plans to bring modern equipment to our farm. The twins debated whether our high school's football team had a chance at the regional championship, with Michael insisting they did, and Matthew citing statistics that suggested otherwise. Sammy described in great detail a nest of baby field mice he discovered in the barn and his plans to build them a better shelter before winter. After breakfast, we all piled into Father's truck for the drive to Millbrook Lutheran Church. It was a small white building with a tall steeple that could be seen for miles across the flat prairie, and nearly every family in our farming community gathered there each Sunday. Mother played the piano for the service, her fingers dancing across the keys with the skill of someone who'd been playing since childhood. That particular Sunday, Reverend Anderson spoke about gratitude and the importance of cherishing the blessings we have while we have them. His words seemed to resonate particularly strongly with Mother, who nodded along and squeezed Father's hand during the sermon. I remember thinking it was a nice message, but I was only 12 and couldn't imagine a world where the blessings I took for granted could simply disappear. After church, several of our neighbors came back to the farm for Sunday dinner, as was common in our community. The Jacobsons brought their 3 daughters, the Schmidts came with their twin boys who were Sammy's age, and old Mr. Peterson, whose wife had died the previous spring, joined us as he did most Sundays since becoming a widower. Mother outdid herself with that dinner. The pot roast was tender enough to cut with a fork, the mashed potatoes were fluffy as clouds, and the green beans from our garden were seasoned with bacon that Father had cured himself. The apple pie, made with cinnamon and just a touch of nutmeg, was declared by Mr. Peterson to be, quote, worthy of the county fair. But it wasn't just the food that made that day special. It was the laughter that filled our dining room, the way the afternoon sunlight streamed through Mother's lace curtains and made everything glow golden, the contentment on Father's face as he looked around the table at his family and friends. Billy entertained everyone with stories from college, doing impressions of his professors that had even stern Mr. Schmidt chuckling. The twins performed a dramatic reading of a poem they'd been assigned in English class, turning it into such a comedy that little Susan Jacobson laughed so hard she nearly choked on her milk. Sammy, not to be outdone, brought in his latest sketches of farm animals and gave a detailed presentation about each one's personality and habits. Mother seemed to glow with happiness that day, moving between kitchen and dining room with graceful efficiency, making sure everyone had enough to eat, and that the conversation flowed smoothly. She had a gift for making people feel welcome, for creating an atmosphere where even the shyest guest felt comfortable joining in the conversation. As the afternoon wore on and our guests prepared to leave, I noticed Mother standing in the doorway watching Father and the boys help load leftover food into the neighbors' trucks. There was something in her expression, a kind of fierce love mixed with what I now recognize as a mother's protective instinct, that stayed with me even though I didn't understand it at the time. "Mama," I asked, tugging on her skirt, "are you feeling all right? You look sad." She knelt down to my level and cupped my face in her soft hands. "Not sad, sweetheart. Just grateful. Sometimes when you love people as much as I love all of you, it can feel almost too big for your heart to hold." That evening, after our guests had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, we gathered in the living room as we did every Sunday evening. Father read aloud from the Bible while Mother worked on her latest quilt, a pattern called Wedding Ring that she was making for Billy to take with him when he eventually married and set up his own household. The boys played a quiet game of cards in the corner, and I worked on my embroidery sampler, practicing the tiny stitches that Mother was teaching me. The only sounds were Father's deep voice reading the familiar words, the soft whisper of needle through fabric, and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Just before bedtime, Mother sat down at the piano and played hymns while we all sang together. Her voice soared above ours, pure and clear, and filled with such joy that it seemed to lift the very rafters of our house. Billy's bass harmonized with Father's tenor, the twins sang in perfect unison, and Sammy's changing voice cracked only slightly on the high notes. When we sang Blessed Assurance, Mother's favorite hymn, I noticed tears glistening in her eyes. But they seemed to be tears of happiness, of overwhelming gratitude for the fullness of her life. "This is my story, this is my song," we sang together, praising my Savior all the day long. None of us could have known that within 3 weeks, our story would change completely. That the voices raised in harmony that evening would soon be silenced forever by grief and anger, and a loss too great for some hearts to bear. But that night, tucked into my bed with the sound of Mother's laughter drifting up from the kitchen where she and Father were having their evening cup of coffee, I fell asleep feeling like the luckiest girl in the world. I had a family that loved me, a home that sheltered me, and a future that stretched ahead filled with endless possibilities. I had no way of knowing that in less than a month, everything I thought I knew about love and safety and family would be shattered beyond recognition. That the brothers who sang with me that evening would become strangers wearing familiar faces. That the protection I took for granted would disappear as suddenly as morning frost in the sun. The last thing I remember about that perfect Sunday was the sound of Mother's voice, soft and content, as she said goodnight to each of us. "Sweet dreams, my darlings. Remember that you are loved beyond measure." How was I to know those would be among the last words of unconditional love I would hear for many years to come? October 15, 1948. A date burned into my memory like a brand on cattle hide. It started as an ordinary Thursday morning with frost covering the pumpkins in Mother's garden and the sound of geese honking their way south for winter. I had no way of knowing that by sunset my entire world would be reduced to ashes, and the word family would take on a meaning darker than anything a 12-year-old girl should ever have to understand. Mother had been feeling poorly for about a week. Nothing serious, we all thought, just tired spells and a nagging cough that she blamed on the changing weather. She was the type of woman who never complained about her health, who would work through a fever rather than let her family go without a proper meal or clean clothes. Even when Father suggested she see Doc Morrison in town, she waved him off with that gentle smile of hers. "It's nothing that a good night's rest won't cure, Robert," she'd say, but I noticed she was moving slower than usual, pausing sometimes to catch her breath while hanging laundry or kneading bread dough. That Thursday morning, she didn't come downstairs at her usual time. Father had already gone out to milk the cows, and the boys were getting restless waiting for breakfast. Billy kept checking his pocket watch. He had an important exam at college that day and couldn't afford to be late for the drive to campus. "Where's Ma?" Michael asked, poking his head into the kitchen where I was attempting to make coffee the way I'd seen Mother do it hundreds of times. At 17, he was used to having meals appear as if by magic, and the idea of Mother not being there to provide them seemed to genuinely confuse him. "Maybe she's just sleeping in," Matthew suggested, though we all knew that Mother had never slept past sunrise in her entire adult life. She was as reliable as the church bells that rang every hour from town. Sammy, always the most intuitive of my brothers, climbed the stairs quietly and knocked softly on our parents' bedroom door. "Mama, are you feeling all right? Do you want me to bring you some tea?" The silence that followed his question seemed to stretch on forever. Then we heard Father's boots on the front porch, heavy and urgent in a way that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. "Boys, Margaret," he called, and something in his voice made us all freeze. "Come quickly!" We found him in the barn, his face white as fresh snow, holding Mother in his arms like she was made of spun glass. She had collapsed while feeding the chickens, her egg basket scattered on the ground beside her, brown and white shells broken and mixing with the dirt and straw. Her breathing was shallow and labored, her skin pale with a grayish tinge that I had never seen before. But her eyes were open, and when she saw us gathered around her, she managed that familiar, gentle smile that had comforted us through scraped knees and childhood fears. "It's all right, my darlings," she whispered, though we could all see it wasn't all right at all. "Don't be frightened. Sometimes these things just happen." Father's hands were shaking as he carried her to the house. Billy ran to hitch up the truck while Matthew sprinted across the fields to the Jacobsons' place to use their telephone and call Doc Morrison. Michael helped Father get Mother settled on the sofa in the living room, and Sammy held her hand while I ran to get pillows and blankets. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and growing dread. Doc Morrison arrived with his black leather bag and grave expression, spending what felt like hours examining Mother while we waited in the kitchen, speaking in whispers and trying not to imagine the worst. When he finally emerged from the living room, his face told us everything we needed to know before he spoke a single word. "Her heart," he said simply, removing his spectacles and cleaning them unnecessarily. "It's been working too hard for too long. Sometimes these things run in families. Sometimes they just happen without warning." Father's voice was barely audible when he asked, "How long?" Doc Morrison looked at each of us boys, then at me, as if calculating how much truth children could bear. "Hours. Maybe a day or two if she rests completely." "I'm sorry, Robert. If we were in Kansas City with the big hospital equipment, maybe, but here." The sound that came from Father's throat wasn't quite human. It was the sound of a man's heart breaking in real time, raw and terrible and final. Billy caught him when his knees buckled, both of them crying openly in a way I had never seen grown men cry before. We took turns, sitting with Mother throughout that endless day. She drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever she was awake, she used her precious energy to comfort us rather than herself. To Father, she whispered words of love and gratitude for their 22 years together. "You gave me the most beautiful life, Robert. Every single day was a gift." To Billy, she spoke about his bright future and how proud she was of the man he was becoming. "Take care of this family for me, son. You're strong enough to carry them through." To the twins, she shared memories of their childhood antics and reminded them how much they meant to each other. "Stay close, boys. You came into this world together for a reason." To Sammy, she spoke about his gentle heart and his gift with growing things. The world needs people like you, sweetheart. People who create beauty and nurture life. And to me, her only daughter, she saved her most important words. I was sitting beside her on the sofa, holding her hand and trying not to cry because I thought it might upset her. "Margaret, my precious girl," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I need you to listen carefully, because this is important. You are going to face difficult times ahead, harder than anything a little girl should have to bear." I started to protest, to tell her she was going to get better and everything would be fine, but she squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Hush now and listen. Sometimes when people are grieving, they forget how to be kind. They forget how to be the people they used to be. Your brothers and your father are going to be lost for a while. They're going to hurt in ways that might make them forget how much they love you." I didn't understand what she meant, but the intensity in her eyes made me nod anyway. "But you remember this, sweetheart. You remember that underneath all that hurt, they are still the same boys who sang with you last Sunday. They are still your protectors, even when they forget how to protect. And you, my brave girl, you are stronger than you know. You have my strength and your grandmother's wisdom, and when the time comes, you'll know what to do." She reached under the sofa cushion and pulled out a small cloth bag that clinked softly when she moved it. "This is money I've been saving for years," she told me, pressing the bag into my hands. "Egg money and butter money that your father doesn't know about. Women need to have something put aside for emergencies. You hide this somewhere safe, and when you need it most, it will be there." As the sun began to set, painting our living room in shades of gold and amber, Mother called all of us to gather around her one last time. Her breathing was more labored now, and we could see the effort each word cost her. "I want you all to know," she said, looking at each face in turn, "that being your wife and mother has been the greatest privilege of my life. You made every day worth living, every sacrifice sweet, every worry worthwhile." She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength for her final words. "Take care of each other. Love each other. Forgive each other when love gets lost in the darkness. And remember that even when I'm not here to see it, every kindness you show, every moment of joy you create, every time you choose love over anger, I will be proud." As the last light faded from the sky, Elizabeth Rose Henderson drew her final breath, surrounded by the family she had loved so completely. Father held her right hand, I held her left, and my 4 brothers stood around us like sentinels, their faces wet with tears that seemed to fall like rain. In that moment, as we listened to the silence where her gentle breathing had been just seconds before, I thought our grief would bind us together. I thought we would hold each other up through the dark days ahead, the way families are supposed to do. I had no way of knowing that grief can be a poison as well as a medicine, that some people, when faced with unbearable loss, don't draw closer to those they love, they push them away. That the very people who should protect you can become the source of your greatest pain. As Father's sobs filled the now silent house, and my brothers stood frozen in shock, I clutched that small bag of coins Mother had given me and tried to remember her words about being stronger than I knew. I would need every ounce of that strength in the months to come. But sitting there in our darkened living room, with Mother's peaceful face illuminated by lamplight and the scent of her lavender soap still lingering in the air, I still believed that love would conquer grief. I still believed that my family would take care of me. Tragically wrong I was. The funeral was held 3 days later on a gray October morning, when the sky looked like it was made of lead, and the wind carried the promise of an early winter. Half the county came to pay their respects to Elizabeth Henderson, filling every pew in Millbrook Lutheran Church, and spilling out onto the front steps. She had touched so many lives with her kindness, her music, her gentle way of making everyone feel valued and heard. I wore the black dress that Mrs. Jacobson had hastily sewn for me, since Mother had never seen the need to prepare funeral clothes for a 12-year-old. It was too big, and made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's tragedy. But sitting in that front pew between Father and Sammy, listening to Reverend Anderson speak about Mother's generous heart and faithful service, the reality of our loss hit me like a physical blow. She was really gone. The woman who had been the sun around which our entire family orbited had simply vanished, leaving us spinning in darkness without any idea how to find our way back to the light. Father was like a man sleepwalking through his own life. He went through the motions of greeting the mourners, accepting their casseroles and condolences, but his eyes were empty, fixed on some distant point that the rest of us couldn't see. When people spoke to him, it took him long moments to respond, as if their words had to travel a great distance before reaching whatever part of him was still functioning. Billy tried to step into the role of family leader that Mother had asked him to assume, but at 19, he was drowning in his own grief while trying to manage college courses, farm responsibilities, and 3 younger siblings who were all falling apart in different ways. He moved with grim determination, making lists of things that needed to be done, speaking to the lawyer about Mother's will, arranging for neighbors to help with the harvest, but I could see the cracks forming in his composure, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the dark circles under his eyes from nights spent staring at the ceiling, the forced cheerfulness in his voice when he tried to comfort the rest of us, as hollow and brittle as eggshells. The twins, who had always been inseparable, seemed to be pulling away from each other for the first time in their lives. Michael threw himself into physical activity with desperate intensity, chopping wood until his hands bled, working in the fields until he collapsed from exhaustion, as if he could somehow exhaust the pain right out of his body. Matthew retreated into books in silence, barely speaking unless directly asked a question. He would sit for hours at Mother's piano, not playing but just touching the keys softly, as if he could somehow summon her back through the instrument she had loved so much. And Sammy, my gentle little brother, who had always found wonder in every growing thing, stopped going to his beloved garden. The plants Mother had helped him nurture began to wither and die, but he wouldn't even look at them. He spent most of his time in the barn, talking to the animals in whispers, as if sharing secrets too painful for human ears. As for me, I tried to fill the impossible void that Mother had left behind. I cooked meals that no one ate, cleaned a house that felt empty no matter how spotless I made it, and attempted to maintain the routines that had once given our family structure and comfort. But I was just a child playing at being a woman, and everyone could see through my efforts to the scared little girl underneath. The first few weeks after the funeral, our neighbors continued to check on us regularly. Mrs. Jacobson would arrive with fresh bread and worried eyes, trying to draw conversation from my increasingly silent brothers. Old Mr. Peterson would stop by to help Father with farm tasks that seemed to overwhelm him now. The church ladies organized meal trains and offers to help with household chores. But grief has a way of making people uncomfortable when it goes on too long. After a month or so, the visits became less frequent, the offers of help more hesitant. People expected us to be getting back to normal, not understanding that normal had died with Mother and we had no idea what was supposed to replace it. It was during this time of isolation that I first noticed the changes beginning in my brothers. Small things at first. Sharp words where there had once been patience, coldness where there had once been warmth, indifference where there had once been protection. Billy, overwhelmed by responsibilities he wasn't prepared for, began to see me as another burden rather than a sister who needed care. When I burned the cornbread one evening, instead of the gentle correction Mother would have given, he exploded with frustrated anger. "For crying out loud, Margaret! Can't you do anything right? Do you have any idea how much that flour costs? We can't afford to waste food because you're too stupid to watch a simple pan of bread." The words hit me like physical blows. Billy had never spoken to me that way in his entire life. When I started to cry, instead of apologizing, he turned away with disgust. "And stop that sniveling. Mother's gone and she's not coming back, so you might as well get used to taking care of yourself. I've got real problems to deal with." The twins, lost in their separate forms of grief, began to close ranks against anyone who tried to penetrate their pain, including me. When I attempted to join them for our usual evening card games, they would exchange looks that clearly communicated I wasn't welcome. "We don't feel like playing tonight," Michael would say, his voice flat and final. "Maybe you should find something else to do," Matthew would add, not even bothering to look up from his book. But it was the change in Sammy that hurt me most. My youngest brother, who had once shared every secret and wonder with me, began to flinch when I came near him. If I tried to sit beside him at meals, he would move to another chair. When I asked about his day, he would give one-word answers and then disappear to the barn. One evening in November, I followed him out there, determined to break through whatever wall he was building between us. "Sammy," I called softly, finding him sitting in an empty stall with our old dog Rex. "I miss talking to you. Did I do something wrong?" He looked up at me with eyes that seemed far too old for his 15-year-old face, eyes that held a hardness I had never seen before. "You want to know what you did wrong?" he asked, his voice quiet but cutting. "You're still here. You're alive and healthy, and Mother isn't. Every time I look at you, I remember that she used up her last strength worrying about what would happen to you instead of fighting to stay with us." The cruelty of those words took my breath away. This was the brother who had once protected baby birds and named every chicken on our farm. The brother who had cried when we had to butcher hogs because he couldn't bear to see any living things suffer. "That's not fair," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't ask her to worry about me. I would trade places with her if I could." "But you can't," he replied, standing up and brushing past me toward the barn door. "So instead, we're stuck with you, and everything is harder because of it." Father, when he noticed these changes at all, seemed to approve of my brother's new harshness toward me. In his devastated state, he appeared to blame me for adding to his burdens, for being another problem he couldn't solve in a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible. "Let the boys be," he would tell me when I complained about their treatment. "They're dealing with enough without having to coddle a little girl who can't accept that life isn't fair." By December, the loving family that had once filled our house with laughter and song had been replaced by 5 strangers who happened to share the same last name and the same roof. We ate meals in silence, went about our daily tasks like sleepwalkers, and retreated to our separate corners each evening without the warmth of conversation or shared activities that had once bound us together. I began to understand what Mother had meant when she warned me that grief might make them forget how to be kind. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. Every day I woke up hoping to see some glimpse of the brothers I had once known, some sign that the love we had shared was still there underneath all the pain and anger. Instead, I watched them harden a little more each day, building walls not just around their hearts but around mine as well. The house that had once been filled with music and laughter became a place of echoing silence and barely controlled hostility. Winter settled over our farm like a blanket of ice, trapping us all inside with our grief and resentment, and the growing sense that something fundamental had broken in our family that might never be repaired. The holidays passed without celebration, marked only by the painful absence of the woman who had made every season magical, with her traditions and joy. And I began to realize that the worst of our story hadn't even begun yet. The coldness and casual cruelty I was experiencing now would seem gentle compared to what was coming. Because grief, when it ferments in isolation and bitterness, can transform into something much darker and more dangerous. Something that would turn my protectors into my predators, and my home into a prison from which there seemed to be no escape. The transformation from coldness to cruelty happened gradually, like water slowly turning to ice. Each day brought small indignities, casual dismissals, and a growing sense that I had somehow become the enemy in my own home. But nothing could have prepared me for the night when emotional abuse crossed the line into something far more sinister and dangerous. It was late January 1949, during one of those bitter Kansas winters where the wind cuts through you like a knife, and the snow piles so high against the windows that the house feels buried alive. We'd been snowed in for 3 days, trapped together in a house that had become more like a collection of armed camps than a family home. The isolation had made everyone's temper shorter and their tolerance for each other practically non-existent. Billy had been drinking more lately, not heavily, but enough that his words carried a sharper edge and his decisions seemed less careful. Father had retreated so far into his grief that he barely acknowledged any of us existed, spending most of his time in the barn even when there was no real work to be done. The twins had developed a language of looks and nods that excluded everyone else, operating as a unit of 2 against the world. And Sammy, my once gentle little brother, had perfected the art of making me feel invisible while somehow also making his contempt perfectly clear. I was in the kitchen that evening attempting to make bread the way Mother had taught me when Billy came in from outside with snow in his hair and whiskey on his breath. He'd been to the Petersons' place, supposedly to check on their livestock, but I could tell from the flush in his cheeks and the looseness of his movements that he'd spent more time with Mr. Peterson's homemade corn liquor than with any animals. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked, pointing at my sad attempt at bread dough with something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so mean-spirited. "I'm making bread for dinner," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're almost out, and the storm means we can't get to town for more." Billy picked up a piece of the dough and squeezed it between his fingers, watching it fall apart with obvious disgust. "This isn't bread, Margaret. This is some kind of paste. Did you even measure the flour, or did you just dump it in like everything else you do?" The criticism stung because I knew he was right. Without Mother's patient guidance, my cooking had become increasingly hit or miss, and we'd all suffered through meals that ranged from bland to barely edible. But her criticism had always come with instruction and encouragement, not the harsh mockery that Billy was showing me now. "I'm trying my best," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Maybe you could help me instead of just pointing out what I'm doing wrong." Something shifted in Billy's expression then. Something dark and calculating that I had never seen before. He stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the alcohol and the bitter scent of winter air that clung to his coat. "Help you?" he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You want help? Here's some help, little sister. Mother's dead. She's been dead for 3 months. And no matter how hard you try to replace her, you never will. You're not the woman of this house. You're just a burden we're stuck with, until you're old enough to find some poor fool to marry you." The words hit me like physical blows, but it was what came next that truly terrified me. Billy reached out and grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. "Maybe it's time someone taught you exactly where you stand in this family now," he continued, his grip tightening until I gasped from the pain. "Maybe you need to learn that being the baby sister doesn't mean you get to expect special treatment anymore." I tried to pull away, but at 19, Billy was strung from farm work and fueled by alcohol and months of accumulated resentment. He twisted my arm behind my back, forcing me to bend forward over the kitchen table, my face pressed against the flour-dusted surface. "Billy, stop," I pleaded, real fear creeping into my voice now. "You're hurting me." "Good," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice even though I couldn't see his face. "Maybe a little hurt will teach you some respect." That's when Michael walked into the kitchen, and for a moment I felt a surge of relief. Surely Michael would intervene, would tell Billy to stop, would remember that he was supposed to protect me, not hurt me. Instead, Michael leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms, watching the scene with detached interest, as if it were mildly entertaining theater. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone conversational. "Just teaching our little princess some manners," Billy replied, pressing down harder on my arm until I cried out. "She seems to think she can talk back to her betters." Michael nodded thoughtfully, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "About time, I'd say. She's been getting pretty mouthy lately." The casual way they discussed my punishment while I was bent over the table, helpless and scared, was almost worse than the physical pain. These were my brothers, the boys who had once carried me on their shoulders and protected me from playground bullies. Now they were talking about me like I was livestock that needed breaking. "Please," I whispered, tears mixing with the flour on the table surface. "I'll do better. I'll try harder with the cooking. Just let me go." "Oh, you'll definitely do better," Billy agreed, finally releasing my arm and stepping back. I straightened up slowly, rubbing the circulation back into my numb fingers, and fighting the urge to run from the room. "But first, you're going to clean up this mess you made with the bread," he continued, gesturing at the failed dough scattered across the counter. "And then you're going to scrub this entire kitchen until it's spotless. And you're going to do it without dinner, since you obviously don't deserve to eat the food that better cooks than you prepared." "That's not fair," I protested, the words out of my mouth before I could stop them. "I haven't eaten since breakfast, and I've been working all day." The slap came so fast I didn't see it coming. Billy's open palm caught me across the cheek with enough force to snap my head to the side and bring fresh tears to my eyes. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh seemed to echo in the suddenly silent kitchen. "Fair?" Billy repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about fair? Is it fair that Mother's dead, and we're stuck taking care of a useless little girl who can't even make edible bread?" Is it fair that father can barely get out of bed in the morning because he's so broken up about losing his wife? Is it fair that I had to drop out of college to keep this farm running? Each question was punctuated by another slap, until my cheek was burning and my ears were ringing. Through my tears, I could see Michael still standing in the doorway, watching with the same detached interest, making no move to intervene. Life isn't fair, Margaret, Billy concluded, grabbing my chin and forcing me to look at him. And the sooner you learn that, the easier things will be for all of us. It was then that Matthew and Sammy appeared in the kitchen, drawn by the sound of the confrontation. I looked at them desperately, hoping to see some trace of the brothers who had once loved me, some spark of protection or concern. Instead, I saw cold satisfaction in their eyes, as if they were pleased to see me finally receiving what they believed I deserved. "What did she do now?" Matthew asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table as if preparing to enjoy a show. "Got mouthy about her cooking," Michael replied. "Billy's setting her straight." Sammy nodded approvingly. "About time someone did. She's been acting like she's something special ever since the funeral." The casual way they discussed my humiliation, the complete absence of any protective instinct, finally broke something inside me that had been holding on desperately to hope. These weren't my brothers anymore. They were strangers wearing familiar faces, and those strangers seemed to actively hate me. "Now," Billy said, releasing my chin and stepping back, "you're going to clean this kitchen like I told you. And if I hear one word of complaint, if I see one tear, if you do anything other than exactly what you're told, things are going to get much worse for you. Do you understand?" I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "Good. And Margaret?" He leaned close enough that his breath tickled my ear. "This is just the beginning. You're going to learn your place in this family, one lesson at a time." As my 4 brothers filed out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my burning cheek and trembling hands, I began to understand that the worst thing about my new reality wasn't the physical pain, or even the humiliation. It was the knowledge that the people who were supposed to love and protect me had chosen to become my tormentors instead. And somewhere in the back of my mind, Mother's voice whispered the warning she had given me on her deathbed. Sometimes when people are grieving, they forget how to be kind. But even she, with all her wisdom and intuition, could never have imagined how far that forgetfulness would go. How grief could transform love into hatred, protection into predation, and a family home into a prison where the inmates were also the guards. That night, as I scrubbed the kitchen floor on my hands and knees while my stomach cramped with hunger, I finally accepted the truth I had been fighting for months. My brothers were gone. In their place were 4 young men who saw me not as family, but as something to be controlled, punished, and broken. And I was completely alone. Yatban. After that night in the kitchen, a new order established itself in our house, as rigid and unforgiving as the frozen ground outside. I was no longer Margaret Henderson, beloved daughter and sister. I had become something else entirely, a servant, a scapegoat, a target for all the rage and grief that my brothers couldn't direct at the real source of their pain. The rules of my new existence weren't written down anywhere, but they were made crystal clear through daily enforcement. I was to wake before dawn and have coffee ready before any of them came downstairs. I was to prepare all meals, clean the entire house, tend to the laundry, and manage the garden come spring, all without complaint, without mistakes, and without expecting gratitude. Any failure, no matter how small, would be met with punishment that ranged from withheld meals to physical corrections that left bruises I had to hide under long sleeves and high collars. Any sign of defiance or even sadness would bring swift retribution from whichever brother happened to notice my transgression. Billy, as the eldest, appointed himself the primary enforcer of discipline. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in finding fault with my work, inspecting the house each evening like a military officer looking for violations. A spot of dust on the mantelpiece might earn me a night without dinner. Bread that was slightly too brown could result in a beating with the wooden spoon Mother had once used for stirring, but which now served a much darker purpose. "You're getting sloppy, Margaret," he would say, his voice carrying that false reasonableness that had become more terrifying than outright anger. "Mother never would have allowed standards to slip like this. Maybe you need a reminder of what quality work looks like." the twins developed their own particular form of torment. Michael, with his athlete's strength, would grab my arm or shoulder hard enough to leave finger-shaped bruises, usually while making some casual observation about my failures. "This floor isn't clean enough," he might say, his grip tightening until I gasped. "Do it again." Matthew, always the intellectual, preferred psychological warfare. He would criticize my intelligence, my appearance, my very existence, with cutting precision that sliced deeper than any physical blow. "It's no wonder Mother died when she did," he told me one February morning while I served him breakfast. "She probably couldn't stand the thought of watching you grow up to be such a disappointment." But it was Sammy's transformation that hurt me most deeply. My youngest brother, who had once been my closest confidant, became perhaps the cruelest of all. His gentle nature, twisted by grief, and the influence of his older brothers, manifested as cold indifference punctuated by moments of startling viciousness. He would trip me when I was carrying heavy loads, then look at me with mock concern as I picked up scattered dishes or spilled water. He would hide my few remaining personal possessions, then watch with satisfied eyes as I searched frantically for my mother's hairbrush or the one photograph I had of our family during happier times. "Maybe if you took better care of your things, Margaret, you wouldn't lose them so often," he would say with sweet innocence that fooled no one, least of all me. Father, when he noticed these interactions at all, seemed to view them as natural and even beneficial. In his broken state, he had convinced himself that hardship would make me stronger, that learning to endure suffering was somehow preparing me for the harsh realities of adult life. "Your mother always worried that we spoiled you too much," he told me one evening when I came to him with bruises on my arms that Billy had left after finding cobwebs in the corners of the barn. "Maybe this is God's way of teaching you discipline." The physical abuse was terrible, but it was the systematic destruction of my sense of self that truly broke me down. Every day brought new reminders that I was unwanted, unloved, and barely tolerated. I began to believe that maybe they were right. Maybe I was a burden. Maybe I did deserve the treatment I was receiving. Maybe Mother's death really was somehow my fault. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror because I couldn't stand to see the hollow-eyed, frightened creature I had become. My clothes hung loose on my shrinking frame, since meals were often denied as punishment for real or imagined infractions. My hair, once Mother's pride and joy, hung limp and lifeless, because I was no longer allowed to use the good soap or spend time on personal grooming. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Our neighbors still occasionally stopped by, but my brothers had perfected the art of presenting a united front to the outside world. When visitors came, I was expected to stay in the kitchen or upstairs, out of sight and silent. If anyone asked about me, the boys would smile sadly and explain that I was still struggling with grief, that I preferred solitude while I healed. "Poor little thing," I heard Mrs. Jacobson say to Billy one Sunday after church. "Losing her mother at such a tender age, it's natural that she'd want to keep to herself." "We're doing our best to give her space to grieve," Billy replied with such convincing sincerity that even I almost believed him. "She'll come around when she's ready." But the truth was that I was disappearing, piece by piece, day by day. The confident, happy girl who had once sung hymns with her family and dreamed of becoming a teacher was being systematically erased, replaced by a frightened shadow who lived only to avoid the next punishment. The worst incident came in early March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the slowly melting snow and the earliest bulbs pushing through the frozen ground. I had been working in the kitchen, preparing what I hoped would be an acceptable dinner, when I heard shouting from the barn. Father had been trying to repair a broken harness and had grown frustrated with the stubborn leather. In his anger, he had thrown his tools, and one of them had struck Duchess, our old tabby cat, who had been sleeping peacefully in a pile of hay. The blow didn't kill her, but it injured her badly enough that she was clearly suffering. Her back leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and she was making pitiful crying sounds that cut through me like knives. I ran to the barn without thinking, dropping the wooden spoon I had been using to stir the stew. When I saw Duchess lying there, hurt and afraid, something in my heart broke open. "Oh, sweetie," I whispered, kneeling beside her and gently stroking her fur. "It's going to be all right. I'll take care of you." But when I looked up at Father, expecting to see remorse or concern, I found only cold annoyance. "Move away from that animal, Margaret," he ordered. "It's just a cat. We have more important things to worry about." "She's hurt," I protested, carefully lifting Duchess and cradling her against my chest. "We need to take her to the veterinarian in town. Dr. Walsh can fix her leg." Father's face darkened with anger. "We're not spending money on a vet for a barn cat. Put it down and get back to your work." "But she's family," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "She's been with us for 8 years. Mother loved her. We can't just let her suffer." The silence that followed my outburst was deafening. Father's eyes narrowed, and I could see my brothers gathering in the barn doorway behind him, drawn by the sound of raised voices. "Family?" Father repeated, his voice deadly quiet. "You think a cat is family? Let me tell you something about family, girl. Family contributes. Family works. Family doesn't cost money we don't have for pointless veterinary bills." He reached for Duchess, but I pulled back, protecting her with my body. "I have money," I said desperately, thinking of the coins Mother had given me, hidden in a sock in my bedroom. "I can pay for it myself." "You don't have money," Billy said, stepping into the barn with a cruel smile. "You don't own anything in this house. Everything you have belongs to us." "Now put that cat down," Father commanded, "and get back to the house before you make this worse for yourself." I looked around at their faces. Father's cold anger, Billy's anticipatory cruelty, the twins' detached amusement, Sammy's growing excitement at the possibility of witnessing my punishment. And I realized that this was a test, a line drawn in the dirt, to see if I would finally submit completely to their will. But holding Duchess's warm, trusting body against mine, feeling her small heart beating rapidly with pain and fear, I found a spark of the girl I used to be. The girl who had been raised to show kindness to all living things, who had been taught that mercy was a virtue and cruelty was a sin. "No," I said quietly, but clearly enough that everyone heard. "I won't let her suffer just because you don't care." The beating that followed was the worst I had received yet. Father used his leather belt while my brothers held me down, and the physical pain was excruciating. But worse than the welts and bruises was what they did afterward. They took Duchess from my arms and made me watch as Billy ended her suffering, not with a merciful quick blow but by slowly drowning her in the horse trough, while she struggled weakly against the water. "This is what happens when you defy us," he told me as I sobbed helplessly. "Remember that the next time you think about standing up for anything or anyone. We decide what lives and what dies in this house. We decide what matters and what doesn't. And you, little sister, don't matter at all." That night, as I lay in my bed with every muscle in my body screaming from the beating and my heart shattered from watching Duchess die, I finally understood the full scope of what my family had become. They weren't just neglecting me or even just abusing me. They were systematically destroying every part of who I had been, replacing love with fear, hope with despair, kindness with cruelty. They were teaching me that mercy was weakness, that compassion was foolishness, that the only way to survive in this new world was to become as hard and unfeeling as they had become. But as I clutched Mother's hidden money to my chest and remembered her words about being stronger than I knew, I made a promise to myself, and to Duchess's memory. I would survive this. I would endure whatever they did to me. And someday, somehow, I would find a way to escape the prison my home had become. Tirati. Even if it took years. Even if it cost me everything I had left to lose. Spring arrived late that year. But when it finally came, it brought with it a revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about my brothers and the depths of their corruption. What I discovered on that warm April morning in 1949 made me realize that the abuse I had been enduring was just the surface of something far more sinister and dangerous. I had been sent to clean out the root cellar, a task that my brothers knew I hated because the dark, musty space reminded me too much of a grave. It was cramped and spider-infested, with stone walls that wept moisture and wooden shelves that groaned under the weight of preserves and stored vegetables. As I worked my way through the dusty jars, checking for spoilage and reorganizing the dwindling winter supplies, I heard voices coming from the main part of the basement above me. The root cellar was connected to our regular basement by a narrow passage, and sound carried strangely through the stone walls and wooden beams. At first, I didn't pay much attention. My brothers often gathered in the basement to drink and talk, especially since Father had been spending more time there himself, away from the memories that haunted the rest of the house. But as I continued working, something about their conversation made me pause and listen more carefully. "Can't keep using the same spot," Billy was saying, his voice carrying the authority he'd assumed as head of the household. "Peterson's been asking too many questions about his missing livestock." "Maybe Peterson needs to learn to mind his own business," Michael replied, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. It was the same voice he used when he was hurting me, but magnified somehow, more threatening. "We can't afford to draw attention," Matthew said with his usual calculating precision. "The beauty of our current arrangement is that no one suspects anything. We're the grieving Henderson family, trying to hold things together after our tragic loss." Sammy's voice joined the conversation, and hearing him speak with the same cold calculation as his older brothers sent chills down my spine. "What about the Miller place?" "They've got that back pasture that nobody ever checks. Perfect for our purposes." "Too close to the main road," Billy dismissed. "We need somewhere more isolated. Somewhere we can work without interruption." "Work? What kind of work were they talking about? And why did they need to worry about being interrupted?" I crept closer to the passage connecting the root cellar to the main basement, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid they might hear it. Through a crack in the wooden partition, I could see them gathered around Father's old workbench, but what was spread across its surface made my stomach lurch with terror. Money. More money than I had ever seen in my life, sorted into neat piles and bound with string. But it wasn't the amount that frightened me. It was the condition of some of the bills. They were stained with what looked suspiciously like dried blood, and scattered among them were personal items that clearly didn't belong to my family. A woman's gold wedding ring, a man's pocket watch, a child's small leather shoe. "The Watson job paid better than expected," Billy continued, picking up the pocket watch and examining it with satisfaction. "Old man fought harder than we thought he would, but the result was the same." My legs nearly gave out beneath me as the implications of what I was hearing began to sink in. Jobs? Fighting? Blood money and personal belongings from strangers? "Speaking of results," Matthew said, his voice taking on that analytical tone he used when solving problems, "we need to discuss what to do about Margaret." At the sound of my own name, every muscle in my body tensed. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, trying to become invisible while straining to hear every word. "She's becoming a liability," he continued. "She's old enough now to understand things she shouldn't understand, and that business with the cat showed she still has fight in her." "She's seen too much," Michael agreed. "The way she looks at us sometimes, she knows something's different. It's only a matter of time before she puts the pieces together, or before she says something to the wrong person," Sammy added, his voice carrying none of the gentleness that had once defined him. "Mrs. Jacobson was asking about her again after church last Sunday, wanting to know why she never comes to visit anymore." Billy was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I could practically hear him thinking through options with the same methodical approach he used for farm planning. "We have a few choices," he finally said. "We could arrange an accident, make it look like she fell in the creek or got kicked by one of the horses. People would sympathize with our family's run of bad luck." The casual way he discussed murdering me, as if it were no different from deciding which field to plant with corn, made bile rise in my throat. These weren't my brothers anymore. They were monsters wearing familiar faces, and they were planning to kill me. "Too risky," Matthew objected. "Too many accidents and people start asking questions. Besides, she's useful. Someone has to do the cooking and cleaning, and hiring help would mean outsiders in the house." "Then what do you suggest?" Billy asked. "Insurance," Matthew replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "We make sure she understands the consequences of talking. We give her something to lose that's more important to her than telling tales." Like what? Sammy asked. She doesn't have anything left that matters to her. Oh, but she does, Matthew said softly. She has her life. And more importantly, she has the lives of other people she might care about. Mrs. Jacobson, for instance. Or little Sally Peterson. Or any number of people in town who might suffer if Margaret decided to become a problem. The threat was crystal clear, and it hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to control me through fear for my own safety. They were threatening to hurt innocent people if I ever tried to expose what they were doing. Brilliant, Billy said with genuine admiration. She's always been soft-hearted about other people. The threat alone should be enough to keep her in line. And if it's not, Michael added with casual menace, we can always provide a demonstration. Show her what happens to people who cross the Henderson boys. As they began discussing the logistics of their next job, a robbery and apparent murder planned for a traveling salesman who had been seen in the area, I carefully backed away from the partition and made my way to the farthest corner of the root cellar. My entire body was shaking, not just from fear but from the complete reshaping of reality that their conversation had forced upon me. My brothers weren't just abusing me out of grief and anger. They had become criminals, thieves, and murderers. The money they were counting wasn't from farm sales or odd jobs. It was stolen from people they had killed. And I was living in the same house with them, completely at their mercy, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. How long had this been going on? How many people had died because of their greed and violence? And how had they managed to keep it secret from the community that still saw them as upstanding young men carrying on their family's good name? The answers to those questions would have to wait. Right now, I needed to get out of the cellar and back to the house before they finished their meeting and discovered me missing from my assigned work. I spent the rest of that day in a state of barely controlled terror, going through the motions of my daily tasks while my mind raced with the horrible knowledge I now carried. Every time one of my brothers looked at me, I was sure they could see the truth written on my face. Every casual comment about my whereabouts felt like an interrogation. That night, lying in my bed and staring at the ceiling, I finally understood the full scope of the trap I was in. I wasn't just the victim of family abuse. I was an unwilling accomplice to multiple murders, a witness who could never testify because doing so would mean signing death warrants for innocent people I cared about. Mother's hidden money, which I had once seen as my eventual ticket to freedom, now seemed laughably inadequate against the magnitude of what I was facing. How do you escape from killers who share your last name? How do you run from people who know your every habit, your every friend, your every possible refuge? Pleonate. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me completely, I remembered Mother's final words about being stronger than I knew. Somewhere inside the terrified girl who had just learned she was living with murderers, there had to be the seeds of the woman who would eventually find a way to survive. I just had to figure out how to plant them before my brothers decided that their insurance policy wasn't enough, and that the only way to guarantee my silence was to silence me forever. The game had changed completely. This was no longer about enduring abuse until I was old enough to leave. This was about staying alive long enough to escape before they decided I was too dangerous to let live. The opportunity for escape came 3 months later, on a humid July night, when the cicadas sang so loudly they drowned out all other sounds. It wasn't the carefully planned escape I had been dreaming of. It was sudden, desperate, and born of a moment when staying meant certain death. My brothers had been planning their biggest job yet, robbing the Millbrook Bank during the summer harvest festival when most of the town's money would be deposited after crop sales. They had spent weeks studying the building, learning the routines of the security guard, and plotting their getaway route through the back roads that only locals knew. What they didn't know was that I had been listening to every word, memorizing every detail, and slowly forming a plan of my own. The morning of July 23rd started like any other. I prepared breakfast in silence while my brothers discussed final preparations for that evening's robbery. Father had been sent to visit relatives in the next county, an alibi that would place him far from the scene when the crime occurred. "Remember," Billy was saying as he cleaned his rifle at the kitchen table, "we go in at exactly 9:30, right when the festival fireworks start. The noise will cover any sounds, and everyone will be distracted by the show." "What about witnesses?" Sammy asked, loading bullets into his own weapon with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "There won't be any," Michael replied coldly. Old Henderson, who guards the bank on weekends, is half deaf and practically blind. He won't know what hit him. The casual way they discussed murdering the elderly security guard, a man who had taught Sunday school to half the children in town, made my stomach turn. But it was Matthew's next words that turned my blood to ice. "And when we get back," he said, looking directly at me, "we'll need to take care of our little witness problem once and for all. Can't have Margaret around anymore, knowing what she knows." Billy nodded approvingly. "I've already prepared this story. Tragic accident while we were in town. She fell down the stairs and broke her neck. Probably happened while she was trying to see the fireworks from the upstairs window. They were going to kill me that very night. After using my cooking and cleaning services one last time, after extracting every bit of usefulness from my terrorized existence, they were finally going to dispose of me like garbage. But as I stood there washing dishes with hands that barely trembled, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid anymore. The constant fear that had dominated my life for the past 9 months had crystallized into something harder and colder. Determination. Resolve. The absolute certainty that I would not let them win. Motor. I spent the day going through my usual routines while secretly preparing for what I knew would be my only chance at freedom. I packed a small bundle of clothes and hid it in the chicken coop. I retrieved Mother's hidden money from its hiding place and sewed it into the lining of my coat. Most importantly, I wrote a detailed letter explaining everything I had witnessed and learned about my brother's crimes. As evening approached and my brothers prepared to leave for town, I made my final preparations. I had decided that if I was going to die that night, I wouldn't die as a victim. I would die fighting back. And I would make sure the truth about the Henderson boys died with me. "We'll be back around midnight," Billy told me as they gathered their weapons and dark clothing. "Have some food ready for when we return. We'll be celebrating." "Yes, Billy," I replied meekly, playing the part of the obedient sister one last time. After they left, I waited exactly 30 minutes to make sure they were truly gone. Then I ran to the barn, hitched up our old mare Bessie to the small cart we used for short trips, and began the most terrifying journey of my life. The ride to Millbrook took almost an hour in the darkness, with only the moon and my desperate courage to guide me. Every shadow looked like one of my brothers returning early. Every sound made me think I had been discovered. But somehow, Bessie and I made it to the edge of town just as the festival fireworks were beginning to bloom across the summer sky. I left the horse and cart at the livery stable with a note for the owner, then ran through the crowded streets toward the bank. People were everywhere, families with children pointing at the colorful explosions overhead, couples walking hand in hand, teenagers laughing and flirting in the warm night air. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that 3 armed killers were about to destroy the peace of their small community. I reached the bank just as the biggest firework of the evening exploded overhead, casting everything in brilliant red and gold light. Through the front window I could see old Mr. Henderson sitting at his desk, reading a newspaper by lamplight, completely oblivious to the danger approaching. My brothers were already in position. I could see Billy crouched behind the water trough across the street, Michael hiding in the alley beside the bank, and Matthew positioned near the back entrance. In less than 5 minutes, they would storm inside and murder an innocent man whose only crime was being in their way. I had 2 choices. I could run away right then, escape while they were distracted with their robbery, and leave Mr. Henderson to die. Or I could save his life and risk my own in the process. Phew, the decision took less than a heartbeat. I couldn't let another person die because of my brother's evil, not when I had the power to prevent it. I ran straight to the front door of the bank and began pounding on it with both fists, screaming at the top of my lungs. "Mr. Henderson! Mr. Henderson! There are men with guns coming to rob the bank. They're going to kill you! You have to get help!" The old man looked up from his newspaper in confusion, then saw my terrified face pressed against the glass. He hobbled over to the door, his eyes wide with concern. "Margaret Henderson? Child, what are you doing out here? What's this about guns?" "My brothers!" I shouted, not caring who heard me. "Billy, And Michael and Matthew and Sammy! They're here to rob the bank, and they have rifles. You have to run!" Mr. Henderson's face went white with shock, but he moved with surprising speed for a man his age. He grabbed the rifle he kept behind his desk and fired 2 shots into the air, the traditional signal for help in our small town. The response was immediate. Men came running from every direction, some carrying their own weapons, others just ready to help however they could. The peaceful festival night erupted into chaos as people searched for the source of the alarm. I saw my brothers across the street, their carefully planned robbery falling apart around them. Billy was screaming something at the others, but I couldn't hear his words over the sound of approaching voices and running feet. Then Michael spotted me standing in front of the bank, and his face twisted with a rage so pure and murderous that it seemed to glow in the firelight. "There," he shouted, pointing straight at me. "There's the little bitch who ruined everything." All 4 of my brothers started running toward me, their weapons raised, their faces showing none of the careful masks they had worn in public for so many months. These were the true faces of killers, and they were coming for me with every intention of ending my life right there in the middle of Main Street. But they had made one crucial mistake. By revealing their true nature in front of the entire town, by showing their weapons and their willingness to use them, they had destroyed the carefully constructed facade that had protected them for so long. Sheriff Morrison and 3 of his deputies reached me first, forming a protective barrier between me and my approaching brothers. When Billy raised his rifle toward me, the sheriff shot him through the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive. Matthew was killed instantly when he tried to draw on Sheriff Morrison. Michael was wounded and captured. Sammy, seeing his brothers falling around him, threw down his weapon and surrendered with tears streaming down his face. Billy, bleeding but still conscious, looked at me with such hatred that I thought it might actually kill me on its own. "You destroyed everything," he gasped. "Our whole family, our whole life. I hope you're happy, you little traitor." "I saved lives," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I stopped killers. If that makes me a traitor to this family, then I'm proud to be one." The trials took place that fall, and the truth about the Henderson boys' crimes shocked the entire region. They had been responsible for at least 7 murders over the past year, robbing and killing travelers, merchants, and anyone else who seemed to have money worth taking. Billy and Michael received death sentences. Sammy, being only 16 and showing what the judge called genuine remorse, was sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary. As for me, I was taken in by Sheriff Morrison and his wife, who had lost their own daughter to influenza several years earlier. They gave me something I had almost forgotten existed, a home where I was valued, protected, and loved. I finished my education, became a teacher as Mother had always hoped, and eventually married a good man who treated me with the kindness and respect I had learned to treasure. We raised 3 children together, and I made sure they understood that family should be a source of safety and love, never fear and pain. Father never recovered from the shock of learning what his sons had become. He died alone and broken just 2 years later, taking with him whatever secrets he might have had about how our family had fallen so far into darkness. I lived in that loving second family for 67 more years, but I never forgot the lessons learned in those terrible months after Mother's death. I learned that evil can wear familiar faces, that love can turn to hatred faster than seasons change, and that sometimes the people who should protect you become the ones you need protection from. But I also learned that even in the darkest circumstances, even when everything seems hopeless, there is always a choice between being a victim and being a survivor, between staying silent and speaking truth, between accepting evil and fighting against it. Heispitav, I chose to fight, I chose to survive. And because of that choice, I lived to see my great-grandchildren grow up in a world where family means safety, where home means love, and where the strongest people are those who choose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and protection of the innocent over loyalty to the corrupt. Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against the people we love most. But sometimes, winning those battles is the only way to honor the love we once shared and the people we were meant to become. My name is Margaret Louise Henderson Morrison, And this is my story of how a terrified little girl found the strength to stand up to monsters and choose life over death, truth over lies, and freedom over fear. And I have never, not for one single day, regretted that choice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.